If you have a weak scapula creating shoulder pain and weakness, and you already tried all the different exercises your PT gave you with little to no success, then stick around until the end because I'm going to be giving you my simple routine for quickly fixing your weak scapula in just a few sessions. But to get the fastest results possible, I'm first going to be showing you the hidden pattern within the scapula so you can understand how it moves. Now, the scapula has 6 main movements. You have elevation, which is when the scapula goes up towards the head. You have depression, which is when the scapula moves down towards the glutes. You have protraction, which is when the scapula moves away from the spine. You have retraction, which is when the scapula moves towards the spine. And then you have something like upward rotation, which is when the scapula is able to rotate upward to allow easier movement like flexion and internal rotation. Or you have something like downward rotation, which is the opposite and allows easier extension and external rotation. And for each of these movements, there's at least 2 muscles contracting in order to help it move. Now, confusion begins to set in after you try one strategy, like strengthening the serratus anterior, for example, but it doesn't work and you're not sure what to do. Well, this is when understanding how the scapula works comes into play. Now, to quickly understand this, we're going to be breaking this up into 2 parts, with the first one being the cross or the X in the scapula. What you want to do is you're going to be able to look at this cross on the scapula, and we could actually figure out how it moves by simply looking at the 2 different legs. With the leg going up towards the head and down, you have elevation and you have depression. Now, in order to create elevation, one or more of these muscles has to contract, either the upper traps or the levator scapula. So whenever that happens, the muscles that create depression, those muscles have to stretch out in order to allow that movement. Now, let's say we want to go into depression. Well, same thing happens except in the opposite direction, where now the muscles that create depression, like the pec minor and the lower traps, are going to contract, which pull the scapula down. And that means the muscles that create elevation, like the levator scapula and the upper traps, has to relax in order to allow that stretch and that movement. Now, looking at the other leg of that cross, we can see the same exact pattern here when it comes to retraction and protraction. Once again, whenever you have retraction for things like the rhomboids and the mid traps, you will end up having a stretch in muscles like the serratus anterior or the pec minor. And vice versa, if you're doing more protraction when the shoulder blades move away from the spine, you're going to get more of a contraction in the serratus anterior and the pec minor, versus the rhomboids and the mid traps and the medial deltoids as well. I mean the medial traps. So that's the first quick pattern, right? One muscle contracts, the other one has to relax, and the same thing goes with the other direction. And we can look at this very basically and just ask ourselves, what direction is our scapula in and what direction is it getting pulled? And that will tell us which muscles are weaker and which muscles are stronger. But now let's get into the upward and downward rotation of the scapula, which is a lot more important to understand when it comes to a winged scapula. When it comes to rotation of the scapula, instead of having 2 muscles contract, you actually have 3 different muscles, and they're pulling from 3 different directions. If we're going to take a look at the scapula like a cross in the first section, well, in this portion, when we look at it for rotation, I want you to look at it as a triangle now, as an upside down triangle to be more specific. Taking a look at the anatomy here, what we can see is simply one muscle on each edge of that upside down triangle, creating a pulling effect, which then creates a rotation within the scapula. So in this case, for upper rotation, you have something like the serratus anterior pulling forward, you have the lower traps pulling down, and then the upper traps pulling towards the medial side from the outside portion of the scapula. So basically it's pulling the outside in, which is how it creates that upward rotation. Now, of course, if we take a look at the downward rotation, then we just have to look at the muscles that are right next to the ones that create upward rotation. For example, for downward rotation, we want to look at the levator scapula, the rhomboids, and the pec minor. And again, we see all these muscles are right next to the other ones that create an upward rotation. Now take a look at this pattern right here when you combine both that upside down triangle and that cross. When you have the muscles on top of the scapula, when both of them contract, you're going to get something like elevation. But when one or another contracts, you're going to get a different kind of rotation, either upward or downward. You see that little pattern? Even though they are together and they can contract together to create one type of movement, both of these muscles can also contract independently to create different kinds of rotation. So remember this pattern. If we take a look at the muscles near the spine, we can see something very similar. again, we have the rhomboids and the lower traps. Both of these muscles create retraction whenever they contract, and they do that by contracting together. But when one muscle contracts or another, you're going to get two different kinds of rotation within the scapula, either upwards or downwards. So again, two muscles contract together to create retraction, but when they contract separately from each other, they can create either upward or downward rotation. And finally, we have that other leg in the upside down triangle, which is the lateral, more inside portion, basically. And that's going to be your serratus anterior and your pec minor. And again, both these muscles contract to create protraction of the scapula. Yet, when one contracts or another, you're either going to get upward rotation or downward rotation. This is the pattern of the scapula, and by understanding this basic pattern, we're going to be able to change up and manipulate the routine I'm about to give you in order to make it a lot more personalized for you. And one other quick note here that I found very interesting, notice how there is always one deeper muscle and one more superficial muscle controlling one side of that upside down triangle. Upper traps are more superficial while the levator scapula is deeper. The rhomboids are deeper to the mid traps, and then you have the pec minor, which is deeper to the serratus anterior. I just kind of find it interesting here that the body has a lot of these different patterns that we don't really realize until you look at the whole thing together. So now that you've learned the secret pattern of the scapula, first, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. And then second, let's go over that brand new routine for you to do in order to fix your winged scapula. Now, one of the biggest problems with a winged scapula is that we're going to have a weak serratus anterior. And we can actually use this information to our advantage. Remember how I talked about the cross and how one leg contracts, the other one has to relax, and vice versa? Where now the muscles that create depression, like the pec minor and the lower traps, are going to contract, which pull the scapula down. And that means the muscles that create elevation, like the levator scapula and the upper traps, has to relax in order to allow that stretch and that movement. Well, this is going to come back into play here. If we take that same principle and apply it to a weakened serratus anterior, which is an upward rotator, then we can ask ourselves, if this muscle is weak, then which muscles are going to be stronger and tighter, making that muscle weak in the first place? And in this case, since we know the serratus anterior is an upward rotator, we want to look at the opposite muscles here, which is going to be our downward rotators, the rhomboid, the levator scapula, and the pec minor. So with all this brand new information, the very first step we're going to be doing in this routine is going to be self-massaging all these tighter muscles and the fascia around it, because chances are that fascia is locking these muscles up in a shorn position, which pulls that scapula in a downward rotation, preventing those serratus anterior from fully firing up and pulling that scapula into an upward rotation or even protraction. Starting with the pec minor, go ahead and use a small ball and find the most tender spot within the corner of the chest and begin massaging it for 1 to 2 minutes. The best technique to perform here is going to be either micro movements or a pin and stretch. Next up, lean against the wall with a ball behind your upper neck to begin working on the levator scapula. This muscle is located under the lower traps and attaches to the medial corner of the scapula, which will help you locate the muscle. Now, once again, just like the pec minor, once you find the most tender spot within this muscle, you can either perform some micro movements or a pin and stretch. Drop that ball even lower between the scapula and the spine and look for the most tender spots and perform the same kind of techniques here. Except now, work the area for 2 to 3 minutes instead of 1 to 2 minutes, because the rhomboids do contribute to both retraction and downward rotation, both actions that go completely against the serratus anterior. So now that all those muscles and the fascia is loosened up, we can now move into the second part of this little strategy here, and that is going to be stretching out those same muscles. And the reason why you want to make sure you stretch out these muscles after you massage them is because if you try to stretch them out beforehand, then you are stretching them against tight fascia and tight muscles and maybe even trigger points, which is going to make it a lot harder for that scapula to loosen up. And for a winged scapula specifically, I do believe stretching out the levator scapula and the rhomboids is going to be a bigger bang for your buck. You can stretch out the pec minor, but I don't think that's going to be the biggest issue here. Now, to stretch out your levator scapula, touch your head to the opposite side you want to stretch, trying to touch your ear to your shoulder. Make sure to keep your nose pointing straight and hold the stretch for 1 to 2 minutes. And if that stretch is too long to hold, then do about 3 to 4 sets of 30-second stretches, which equals roughly 90 seconds to 2 minutes. Now to stretch the rhomboids, grab a surface that is in front of you but a little higher in order to help pull that scapula away from the spine. This is going to create a lot of protraction within the scapula, which is going to stretch out the rhomboids. You can even cross your arms for even more protraction and even more of a stretch. Again, hold the stretch for roughly 2 minutes or 3 to 4 sets of 30-second stretches. You may even find it easier to stretch this muscle if you're doing it one arm at a time. So now we move into the final stage here, which is going to be retraining that serratus anterior. One, we now have loosened fascia and muscles around the rhomboids and the levator scapula specifically. And two, we just stretched out those muscles, allowing that scapula to move a lot easier now. And now that we've done all this, that serratus anterior is going to have a much easier chance to fire up and pull on that scapula, which is going to make it much stronger, a lot faster basically. Without doing all those things first, then you have a weak serratus anterior trying to contract against a tight rhomboid that was not stretched and has a lot of fascia wrapped around it. So with that said, here are 2 exercises for your serratus anterior. The first one is going to be a band punch. Anchor a band to an anchor roughly hip to chest heights and grab the other end. From here, punch forward as far as you can to engage the serratus anterior. Let your arm return back to its starting position and then repeat for 3 sets of 15 to 20 reps. Make sure to reach out as far as you can in order to really engage that serratus anterior and even punch up a little higher to get a little more upward rotation. Now the second exercise here is going to be the push-up plus with your arm overhead. Get into the push-up position, but instead of having your hands under your shoulders like normal, have them under the space just above your head. This is going to put your scapula into an upward rotation a little more, which is going to help engage that serratus anterior. Now from here, push away from your hands as you pull your scapula away from your spine and then return back to your starting position and repeat for another 3 sets of 15 to 20 reps. You can either do the push-up plus either on your knees or your feet, whichever one helps you focus more on the serratus anterior while also being challenged. This is my simple routine for quickly fixing your wing scapula, and if you follow along with it, then you should be able to see results in just a few sessions. Now, if you want to see how I came up with the strategy and how effective it is, then make sure to watch my 4-part mini-series on how I helped Leonore fix not only her wing scapula, but also her thoracic outlet syndrome. If you want to check that out, the link's going to be either in the description or you click on the videos popping up in the corner.